Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, rather. Welcome to the Cincinnati Area Board of Realtors Affiliate Committee presentation of the TRID rule. We're on the air today with Mr. Nick Perino from a local title company. My name is Phil Forbes. I am on the Cincinnati Area Board of Realtors Affiliate Committee. I'm actually a lender by trade. And then also present with us today is Miss Casey Stewart. Casey Stewart also serves on the Cincinnati Area Board of Realtors Affiliate Committee, and she is a realtor. And so the three of us are here together today to talk to you about the TRID rule that's coming up. You'll hear a little bit later in the broadcast that it's going to be effective October 3rd, which is a week from Saturday. And we want everyone to understand how this is going to affect their processes going forward and the timing of their closings. So welcome, and we're going to start off with Nick Perino, and we're going to start walking through the first page of our PowerPoint presentation that I believe is on your screen.
Hi, this is Nick Perino. We're here to talk about TRID, and TRID basically is the creation of the new form that integrates both the truth in lending disclosure and RESPA. So they combine it to have TRID as the new form and the new rules around that form that were just created. The form creates new disclosure rules, new sets of documents, and some new liabilities, which can include some penalties that we're going to talk about. The rules are going to change how we schedule closings, how you schedule your closings, and they are putting a lot more emphasis on the lender to get docs out early in a closing. What that means, as far as getting docs out early, when we are starting with new rules, we're going to ask you to change your timing and contracts initially until we see how this affects the ability of the lender to get to the closing table. Some of the challenges that we're going to face involve just the business changes, training, monitoring. The lenders have to keep information in their files forever after this for review at some point to make sure that they're following the rules, and it's going to add a lot to the transaction as far as a lender is concerned. In combining the TIL and the RESPA disclosures, they've basically, it looks to everybody like they've created 3 new pages. They did create a new loan estimate, and then they created the closing disclosure. When you compare the two side by side, they're virtually identical as to where the information is placed, what they look like, and it makes it really easy to compare the initial loan estimate to the final closing disclosure. The strange thing is the closing disclosure looks totally new to us, but in reality, all they've basically done is just reverse the order of the settlement statement that we see today. They've taken what is page 3 of a settlement statement and basically made it page 1 now. You guys as realtors usually don't see page 3. We usually just look at the numbers. Well, page 2 of the current settlement statement is now page 2, and page 1 of the current settlement statement is now page 3. They've basically just reversed the order. Looking at the form, you're going to see that it's pretty familiar to you. It's not a huge change, it's just a change. But what we do see is that it marks the end of the good faith estimate, and at some point we expect it to mark the end of the HUD-1 settlement statement. The HUD-1 settlement statement may be used in conjunction with the closing disclosure initially until we determine that the closing disclosure allows us to disperse off it. There are pre-application requirements, and there's a new definition for application, which is going to create issues for you when you're getting the loan approval letters from the lenders, because you might be getting loan approval letters that do not have an address in them anymore. The address is one of the 6 things that creates a timeline. It starts a timeline for the lender. So lenders may not have an address in those now.
A key point actually in the disclosure that I wanted to kind of highlight from the perspective of a lender is that a lot of what we're showing to the customers in these cases, guys, is not anything that we weren't already showing to the customer. What this new loan estimate and then which is called the LE, and then the CD, the closing disclosure, really shows is the same thing that our former good faith estimate and truth in lending disclosure used to show. So we're really just changing format. We're not adding a lot of new information to what the buyer sees. So if it looks scary or complex, just understand that the things being explained to the customer here is really nothing different than they've seen before. It's just in a little bit different format. And normally, as a realtor, you would have never seen the truth in lending disclosure or the truth in lending disclosure. Sometimes you see a good faith estimate, but the good faith estimate's really pretty clear. So depending on your perspective, it really isn't a tremendous change for what the customer's seeing up front or at the closing. The big changes really boils down to the timelines, and I think we're going to start talking about that right now.
Sure. The new rule puts in place a 3-day waiting period from the delivery of the CD, the closing disclosure, to the customer. And a lot of lenders are going to be sending that out electronically, asking for e-signatures. And once the e-signature is returned, they now have a time-stamped delivery date. That's when they can start the 3-day waiting period. There is a default where if they put it in the mail, it would be 7 days from the time they put it in the mail, and they no longer have to prove delivery. So they don't have to have a return timestamp form or anything. They put it in the mail, and then they know it's 7 days from the time they put it in the mail. The issue here with this 3-day waiting period is we don't know exactly how much time this is going to add to your contract. So initially, because of this, we don't know how responsive the customer is going to be. We don't know exactly when they're going to be able to get these created. They're thinking if loans act the way they do currently, this document will be delivered right before the closing normally would be at 30 days. So what we've been asking people to do is add an extra couple of weeks to your contract just to be safe, so your buyer doesn't have a contract that expires on them while the lender is dealing with this new rule. If you have a closing that you normally would put 30 days on your contract, we're asking you to put 45 days. If you've got a closing that might be an Ohio bond, OFA, rural housing, something that normally would have a 45-day in your contract, we're just asking you to put 60 days. Of course, the lender, if they get it done early, can allow you to close early once they get that delivered, but we don't know exactly how this is going to affect the whole process and the whole system. So we're just asking for extension of these contracts, extend that time frame, just to make sure that we get this down right and we don't lose any contracts during this setup period.
Guys, I think this is a good time for me as a lender to explain to our realtors out there, really the big change for us as a lender. It's always been kind of the rule that we had to have our disclosures out within 3 days after they apply. Well, that was fine. All we had to do was document that we sent them. And so if we sent them electronically, you could do that. If we hit the print button, that was considered good proof that they had been mailed. So really all we had to document was that we had sent the document out. What's changing here is that as we approach closing, it's not a question of whether or not we send the document out. Well, I guess it is, but if we're going to go with just the date that we send it out, then you've got a 7-day waiting period. But if we want that 3-day waiting period to be the number of days that we're using, it's not a question of us sending out. It's a question of the customer actually acknowledging that they got it. And that's what's really critical. A lot of times our customers are slow to respond. They don't necessarily sign the document the day we send it. If we're in a time crunch and this thing's getting sent on, for instance, a Thursday for a Monday closing, I need that customer to jump in there during the business day and electronically sign off that they received it during the business day. It may not be okay for that customer to sign after 5 p.m. That may roll us over to the next day and delay closing by a day. So again, just to highlight the point that's really significant that we as lenders are seeing that's different from anything we've ever dealt with before, is we're no longer dealing with our regulators are no longer grading us on whether or not we sent the document out. They're actually grading us on whether or not the consumer acknowledged receipt. And we don't necessarily, we're not confident we're going to have good control over that consumer to acknowledge that receipt. So that's why we're trying to bring you guys into this discussion and tell you all about this as early as possible so that you can dive in and help us. Tell your customers, hey, by the way, when we get close to closing, there's going to be a document you need to sign off on. And when your lender tells you need to sign off on it, they're really not kidding. Not signing off on that quickly can delay your closing. So.
And I don't know if you're aware that there is currently a 24-hour rule for settlement statements to be delivered prior to a closing. That rule is in place today, but as you know, lenders go around that rule. It's not heavily enforced. It's not enforced at all, actually. And you can ask, well, if that rule is already in place, what's going to happen with the 3-day rule? And the answer is the 3-day rule is going to be adhered to very, very tightly because they not only added a 3-day rule, but they also put a penalty of $10,000 per day of violating that rule. So lenders now have the ability to have up to $30,000 on the first couple violations, $30,000 on one file penalty. The lender no longer cares if you've got an urgent closing and need to close tomorrow. If they haven't got this disclosure out and delivered to the customer, they cannot allow you to close and absolutely will not. There's some talk also about what will extend that 3-day, what causes a new 3-day waiting period, and that can be if the customer changes the loan program, or if somehow the fees change or PMI changes enough to change the APR number from the TILA, the APR number by over an eighth. So there are a couple things that'll trigger a new 3-day, but those things are pretty rare. There was a misconception that any minor change would add another 3 days, and that's not the case. So what does this rule apply to? This rule applies to all your standard loans for residential property. It doesn't apply to equity lines. It doesn't apply to reverse mortgages. It doesn't apply to loans that are on property that's not a residential home. They don't apply to boats, mobile homes, things like that. They also don't apply to commercial property. This rule also doesn't apply to a cash deal if that's not perfectly obvious, because this is a loan protection item for a borrower. This rule takes place on only loan applications taken October 3rd or after. If you have a contract that is prior to October 3rd, that's not indicative of whether this rule applies to that contract. If you get a contract signed and then the customer goes and gets an application for the loan, applies for that loan after or on October 3rd, this rule will still apply. So you can have a contract at the end of September subject to this rule just because of when they applied for that loan.
On that note, I would tell you guys, please be in touch with your lenders on this, because I know from our perspective, we'd like to do as many under the old system as possible. So if you do have something coming in where your contracts may be being negotiated or wrapping up, September 30th, October 1st, get a call into your lender and tell them that that's coming, and the lender can probably get that application package going by October 2, and then you won't have to deal with that in the case of that specific file. We're on to the next page now, talking about pre-approvals. And I think that there was a lot of bad information, and frankly, I think the rule kind of moved around a little bit on us over the course of the last 6 months. So here we are coming down to the final implementation of the rule, and things are starting to get a little bit more clear for us as a lender on what we can do with regard to pre-approvals, et cetera. We as a lender cannot require that the customer provide verifying documentation when we're at the pre-approval stage. Now, we can ask for it, and we encourage you as our partners to encourage the customer to submit that information to us, because you guys want us to give you an accurate pre-approval. And, you know, had a self-employed borrower last night talking to me, telling me about what they earned. When I actually was able to look at their tax returns, it was completely different. So it's really, really important to remember that us being able to verify information carefully is going to be really helpful to you guys. So encourage your customers to provide, you know, as a lot of you already do, encourage your customers to communicate with us early and thoroughly, so that we can have good information for you and help you out, so that what we're providing back to you is accurate. So as we've said earlier, you need 6 pieces of information that really defines a loan application, and generally the final thing that is that defining factor is the property address. So until we've really identified a property, we're really still in the pre-approval stage. It's when that property is defined that we move from pre-approval to loan application status, and that's when we need to, as lenders, we need to get started generating our documents and getting things over to our customers. So.
Okay, so let's talk about the delivery of the closing disclosure. The closing disclosure, as we said, you need at least 3 days from delivery and proof of delivery when you're doing it electronically or doing anything except mailing it, regular mail. The 3 days are 3 business days. They generally will include Saturdays, depending on which lender you're with, but they will exclude Sundays and legal holidays, and you'll see the list of the legal holidays that are excluded right here. The closing disclosure contains page 1, the same information that the customer is going to see on their loan estimate. It's going to have the loan amount, the interest rate, the term, the projected monthly payment, which is principal and interest, and the escrows. It'll also usually have homeowner association dues, so the customer should be provided with the dues for the homeowner association pretty quickly, so the lender can get it on this form. When you look at page 2, as I said, page 2 is basically the current page 2. It's got very small variations to it. As far as the realtors are concerned, the variation is pretty major because they put your commission now at the bottom of the page instead of at the top of the page. So when you go to look at this page, you're going to want to immediately start at the bottom now instead of at the top. But you also are often going to only see the buyer's numbers. And if you're only looking at the buyer's numbers, you are going to have a hard time telling if we have the home warranty on there. Other paid seller items, do we have all those documents on there? Sometimes the transaction fee is only on the seller's side. So for some realtors, the transaction fee does not show up on that closing disclosure. The third page is pretty much page 1 of what we look at today. And that will show if you do have credits from the seller to the buyer, like the prorated property taxes, from the buyer to the seller, like the prorated homeowner association dues. Those will show up on that page, even if you only get the buyer side. The one thing we want to talk about also is the fact that at this moment, lenders are being told that they cannot provide this form to you, the realtor, unless the customer has authorized it. And we are going to be probably getting new authorization forms for these closings that you get signed right up front from your customer, so that this doesn't come up as an issue at the last minute where you can't get your numbers unless your customer sends it to you.
What we've got here, guys, on this page is really kind of an introduction to how these days are going to be counted. so that you can really kind of hopefully start to download the idea of how this is going to change. If we have a closing, for instance, scheduled on Thursday, that means that the final loan closing disclosure, the CD, needs to be hand delivered to the customer on Monday. And in that case, the customer would actually need to sign the document, date the document, and at my employer anyway, and I think a lot of employers are going to be the same way, we're going to want to have that document uploaded into the system on that same day. Once the document's uploaded, then we have neat verification that it was actually signed. Simply having it signed and dated and maybe loaded in the following day or the day after that is not going to generally be adequate. Also allowed is if we have a signed FedEx showing that the customer signed for the receipt of the document via FedEx, UPS, what have you, on that same Monday. The problem with that is, what if the customer isn't home when the FedEx or UPS guy arrives? It can mess up your closing. So you've got kind of an issue. And then finally, if we're having a closing on Thursday, another way to satisfy the requirements would be for us to print the document and mail the document on the preceding Thursday. So in that case, we're 7 days in advance of the closing. And as a result of that, if we've printed and mailed that document on that day, then we feel like we're okay. What you're also going to see here, and what I think a lot of us are going to be using, a lot of us lenders are going to be using, is the option of electronic signature. And I think this is probably going to account for 90% of our files. In the electronic signature scenario, we will have set up with the customer early in the file that we can give things to them electronically, and they'll somewhere sign off that electronic delivery is okay. And then what we'll do is we'll actually send that document to the customer via a situation similar to dot loop that you guys may use now, or any of those electronic signing forms. We won't use dot loop. We're going to use software that's specific to the lending industry, but our industry does have that ability to send these documents to the consumer electronically. In this case, though, what's really important for you guys to recognize is it's not a question that we sent it to them. It's a question that they e-signed it on that day. So we need your help, as I said earlier, as our partners, to highlight the importance with the consumer that, hey, we really, when you get that, you can't dilly-dally, you got to sign it. And the other thing to remember is that just because they sign it and acknowledge that they received it doesn't mean that they agree with it. There's really only a few things in that document that if we change it, it's going to restart the 3-day rule. If they e-sign that document and in e-signing it tell us that the insurance is not correct, we still have the ability to correct that insurance within the 3 days, make it right, and let the closing happen on time. There's really just a limited couple of things that can happen that will adjust and make the closings, that timeline for the closing stop and move forward. And really, those things are, if we add a prepayment penalty, which is virtually unheard of. Most loans, virtually no loans, have a prepayment penalty, much less adding it within 3 days of the closing. We're certainly not going to do that. If we were to change loan product, that would trigger a 3-day delay. But it's not like on the final 3 days we bother to tell the customer that we changed their loan from a conventional to an FHA. So again, not very likely at all. And then the final thing is, if the APR were to change by more than 1/8%, and that's really unlikely also. It's very, very rare that those situations would happen. And so those are really about the only 3 things that are going to restart your 3-day rule. A lot of standard things that change at the end, maybe a seller credit for some work that wasn't completed, or a change in the homeowner's insurance or a change in the escrows, any of those things that change are not going to restart that 3-day clock. You're still going to be able to move forward with your closing and close on time.
So we know that the buyer may not be able to ask that the lender send the closing disclosure to you without a signed consent form. But we also now have a second form. It's a seller side closing disclosure. The seller's side closing disclosure is technically not part of a protection for the customer, so it's not subject to the 3-day rule. And it's probably going to be delivered by the title agent since it's not part of that 3-day rule and the $10,000 penalty item. That'll probably be produced by the title agent, delivered to your seller, delivered to you. There's no issue with having that delivered to you. The seller's side is going to be missing all of the loan information, obviously, your interest rate, your payment for the customer. They're going to put the information from you on the front page instead of on a later page as on the buyer's closing disclosure, meaning your sale number, your realtor number, your broker number, my title agency number for the insurance licensing. Those numbers are going to be right on the front page now for the seller's side. But we do have a seller side closing disclosure and a buyer side closing disclosure. So right off the bat, I wanted to ask Phil a quick question. When you are looking for delivery of that closing disclosure and you have 2 borrowers that you email this out and there's 2 borrowers and you're asking for an e-sign, can just one of them e-sign and send it back to you?
I believe we need to have both borrowers e-sign it. So again, very critical that we've got participation here and everybody's aware. So yeah, we definitely want everybody signing off on it. And actually an interesting point here is that we need acknowledgement not only from the borrowers, but anybody who has an interest in the property. So if you have a non-borrowing spouse, they could very well be expected and required to e-sign on the closing disclosure. So very important. Or for instance, you might have property where it's owned by, an individual and their parents. And the individual is on the loan, but the parents are also on the deed. In that case, you also need those parents to sign off on the closing disclosure because, again, it's their real estate that's becoming collateral on this loan. So the thought behind it is that we should be informing them of the loan being placed, using that real estate as collateral. So very important and actually kind of a unique question. I haven't heard that one in all these discussions up to this point, but it's a great point. We need to include all people that are on title.
From a realtor perspective, we've talked a little bit about how an agent can effectively help through this process by making sure that their clients are informed about deadlines and recommending that income info being provided during the pre-approval process will ensure that you're getting the most accurate information possible, making sure that they're signing those delivery confirmations. Are there any other recommendations you have for realtors in helping this process go more smoothly?
Right off the bat, the first thing you really want to emphasize is that they are available when it's time for this closing disclosure to be delivered, because some of them will get their emails after work. They, as you know, don't always treat closings as priority anymore. Their little kids' volleyball practice is more important than the closing coming up. And we understand that the customers in general are busier today, but they have tended to change the priority away from the purchase of the home to other items, which doesn't make any sense to me. So emphasizing how important it is to be available and return that, get it signed, e-signed, get it returned quickly during the business day, not after 5. That's very, very important.
Another point that I would like to bring up, I like the ins are important, right? So as soon as the contract is accepted, you need your inspection. You should also be getting your insurance. So insurance is a critical number that we need to generate this disclosure. And a lot of times People kind of gloss over that and think, oh yeah, I'll call my agent the day before closing or the day of closing or after I buy the house to get my insurance. And we've been stressing insurance now for about a year to get the insurance early. And again, it's all about setting expectations. And if we set expectations with our customer that, you know, it's a little bit different world. We need to do a lot of, you know, we're still doing the same things. It's just the timeline changes a little bit. It's important that we make sure that they get their inspections and insurance completed quickly. Are there any questions from the participants? You've got the ability, I believe, to hit a raise your hand. And if you want to do that, please do that. I'm looking to see if any questions are popping up there on the webinar forum. I'm not seeing any so far.
I've got one more for you guys, and this is a worst case scenario. I know when we were talking about this 6 months ago that everyone was like, oh, every single little change is going to cause a 3-day delay, and clearly that's not the case. That would have been very impractical. But what if there is a delay and that causes the closing to be pushed past whatever rate lock the borrower had in place? Has anyone discussed that?
That's probably going to be a lender-to-lender kind of scenario. Usually a day or two of rate lock, I would expect, you know, I've been in the industry for 20 years. Usually a day or two of rate lock can somehow one way or another be absorbed by the lender. So I don't think a day or two delay is really going to be a significant problem. Will there be situations that it is? Yes, probably. But I don't think that that's going to be something we see on certainly not a common basis. I would be surprised if that affects even 1 in 200 deals.
Since we don't see any questions yet, I wanted to run through the scheduling of a closing now and how the scheduling differs from what you're used to. What you're used to as a realtor is normally you hear the lender may be ready, you know your contract is coming to fruition very quickly, so you call the title agency and you schedule the closing with them, make sure they get it on the books. You ask them to coordinate with the lender so we have everything ready for your closing. We then contact the lender as a title agent and we confirm we've got this closing scheduled. Do you think you're going to make it? If they're pretty positive, we don't respond to the realtor in any kind of negative fashion. We just keep it there and we move toward that closing. That's not going to be the way it's scheduled any longer. The lender has to have that 3 days. So I'm not going to be pushing a lender to schedule it. They're going to be pushing me to not schedule it. I cannot schedule until after they get this e-sign or delivery proven for their file. And again, their penalties are significant and therefore they don't really care so much if your closing was supposed to happen tomorrow if they don't have a closing disclosure delivered. It's not going to happen tomorrow. They have to get it delivered. They have to wait the 3 days and then they will allow us to close. And so the lender will tell us what day or after what day we can do the closing, and then we'll contact you and let you know we can close this day or after. Just give us when you want it on the books and we'll get it scheduled with the lender and then we'll work backwards from there. So it's going to be a little bit of a change in scheduling.
Yeah, and that's a key point. Once it's scheduled, that date actually will affect the closing disclosure. It's unlikely that it would affect it by that full 8th to trigger a change, but it will affect the closing disclosure. So probably important to set a date 10 days in advance or so, so that once it's set, we can generate the closing disclosure and it's right. But you know, closing them quicker just because everything's ready probably isn't going to work as well.
Right. So that last minute, throw this on, see if the lender can get us numbers, that's not going to happen any longer.
It's going to be a new world, and you know, we learned to deal with it. In 1973, the good faith estimate and the truth in lending disclosure were introduced. I was not in the lending industry at that time. I think I was still in diapers. But I would expect back then it was considered crazy and difficult, and you know, everybody was like, oh, this is going to stop mortgage lending as we know it. And clearly it continued. I think about 3 months from now, we'll look back on this and think about it something kind of like the Y2K issue we had, you know, where we thought the whole world was going to end. And then, you know, September 2nd or January 2nd, 2000 rolled around and we realized it was all going to be okay. So anyway, folks, thanks so much for listening. I hope that this has been helpful to you. Feel free to forward and share. There will be a link on the CABR website. Have a great day.
Thank you.